I want to start welcoming you all. This is our first in a series of programs sponsored by the Friends of the ASM Collections and organized by our program committee consisting of Jenlyn Tellman, Sue Thompson, and Gail Gibbons. So thanks to all of you for your work in putting together these programs. So that being said, let me now introduce our speaker today, Dr. Suzanne Eckert, who's the head of collections at ASM. Most of you probably know her, and she'll be sharing some of her favorite things with us. Suze earned her doctorate in 2003 in anthropology at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on how pre-colonial and colonial cultures organized ceramic technology and how it integrated with other aspects of society. No raindrops on roses or whiskers on kittens. Suze's favorite things are made out of clay. Take it away, Suze.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you for inviting me. For those of you who have seen my talks before, you probably know I like to start with definitions. So today is no different. We're going to be talking about slips and paints and color. So a slip, for those of you who don't know, is a watered down clay that usually covers the entire surface of a vessel. It's often in Southwestern pottery thought of as the background color. So when we say membrace black on white, the white is the slip that we're talking about. It covers the entire surface and it makes for a nice flat background. That there are different kinds of slips, but we don't need to go into that detail. What I'm talking about is that background color with slips. A paint is a colored substance that is applied in patterns to create designs on a vessel surface. So here in this picture, the black is a paint, the red is a paint that's used as filler, and the buff background color here is a slip, as we just talked about. Paints can be made from any variety of materials. Organic material was common in the Southwest, so usually plants or ash. Minerals, various kinds of minerals. For those of you familiar with Hohokam pottery, hematite was really common. And for those of you familiar with glazewares, galena was really common, but there are other minerals that were used as well. They can also have a combination of the two. There are lots of places that mixed and matched organic and minerals to make their paint. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And then glaze paint, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, is a special instance of a mineral paint. So it is mineral, but I'll talk about what makes it special in a little bit. So usually when we think of pottery design, we think about what is portrayed by the paint. So often these are recognizable images like shown here. So you've got people, you've got dancers, you've got a fish with feet. And then in the Ramos Polychrome, there are birds. And so they're recognizable images. But it also could be abstract or geometric designs. And actually in the Southwest, that is exceedingly common. It's more common than to have actual recognizable images. And these abstract or geometric designs may represent something in an abstract sort of way, or they may simply be geometric designs. And there's lots of discussion and constant interpretation, reinterpretations, and overinterpretations of geometric designs. But slips and paints, at least when I'm looking at pottery in my head, are much more than just their designs in the way that we think about it. And that's what I want to talk about today. So as usual, I'll be going to focus primarily on ancestral Pueblo pottery because that's what I specialize in. And this picture here is a summary from a talk that I gave to the Friends of Collections in 2016, where I talked about Pueblo pottery, and the summary and the theme and the one thing everybody was supposed to take away from it was that Pueblo pottery is more colorful through time, except for when it's not. So today I'm going to expand upon how I think about color on pottery when I walk through the vault and look at various different kinds of designs. And I have four sort of mini themes that I want to talk about in that regard. So color on ancestral Pueblo pottery, I think, is more than just the background. Much of the paints are blacks or reds, but the background colors can vary. And so this is, I think, a beautiful quote that summarizes the importance of color. Among Pueblo people, it symbolizes a whole bunch of different things. It symbolizes directions, and although different Pueblos have different directions that are associated with specific colors, like west is really commonly associated with the color blue. And when I've talked to the Zuni about that, that's because the Pacific Ocean is to the west. But different Pueblos have different specifics. It can identify group affiliations, often groups that have migrated from specific directions. Certain colors can be used to cure illnesses and ailments, can be used to affect the weather and summon the kachinas, which is part of the affecting of the weather, and various other things. So color is really important in terms of how it is used among modern and historic Pueblo people. And the assumption is that that was probably true moving backwards in time, at least for a while. So what I want to talk about today is color in terms of design horizons. And I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with the concept of a pottery ware, which is a tradition of making pottery that covers a large time period, usually in a small regional area. So Hopi yellowware, which I assume that most of you, if not all of you, know what I'm talking about when I say Hopi yellowware. Made for hundreds of years in the Hopi area, and it has a distinctive yellow color because of the clay. A pottery type is a collection of attributes or characteristics that usually covers a short time period, and by short, I mean 50 to 100 years in a small regional area. And again, think Mimbres black on white pottery, classic Mimbres black on white with the images of people and animals and those kinds of representation. Very short time period, very small area, and most people are familiar with that. What I want to talk about today is a pottery horizon, which is usually a single characteristic that cross-cuts multiple regions, so huge areas of the Southwest. And in my case, like all of the Pueblo area, and as we were going to talk about, sometimes in the Hohokam area and also sometimes in the Casas Grandes. Horizons often last for only a relatively short period of time. So again, sometimes less than 100 years, but some can be fairly long-standing. So today we're talking about design horizons, which I hope is new to many of you. And an example of a pottery horizon is, I just talked about Hopi yellowware. So we here at ASM, and I think in Arizona in general, associate yellow slips with the Hopi. But in reality, during the mid 1300s to the mid 1400s, yellow slips were common across much of the ancestral Pueblo world. And as a matter of fact, in the Rio Grande area where I work, potters living in the Galisteo Basin villages are known for producing yellow slipped pottery. And if you talk to a Rio Grande archaeologist about yellow pottery and having found yellow pottery, they don't think Hopi, they think Galisteo Basin. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of horizon, is this idea of yellow pottery being made across a huge area and cutting different villages and different language groups and different Pueblo groups. So now I'm going to provide 4 examples. Some of these horizons are very well thought out, and I spend a lot of time thinking about them and talking about them with my colleagues. Some of them are just things that archaeologists chat about with one another, but there's not really any publications about them yet. So there's sort of different levels of depth that I can go into for some of these if you have questions. Okay. The first horizon I want to talk about is polychrome slips. And this is actually one that I dealt with in my dissertation. So throughout much of the ancestral Pueblo world, pottery, there was only one slip color on a vessel. And it was normally white. And then a little bit later through time, it's red. And you can have red vessels and you can have white vessels. So white was the most common up to about the mid 1100s. And then you also start getting red, and then red becomes more and more common. But in the late 1200s, early 1300s, you start getting polychrome slips. So you have two slip colors. This most commonly shows up on vessels, on bowls that are a light slip color on the inside, so either white or yellow, and then red on the outside. And this happens, it continues to the 1300s, 1400s, and beyond. This happens in the Western Pueblo region. This happens in the Mogollon region. It happens in the Rio Grande region, and it happens, lots of different types have these names. And it's common for different cultural groups, but also it's common to happen at the same time that you also are getting red slipped pottery. So you get a polychrome slipped pottery at a village that's being locally made, and then you also get red slipped pottery. So why? And this was one of the questions that I have looked at in a variety of places throughout the Western Pueblo, Mogollon, and Zuni areas. So today, I'll talk briefly about the Zuni example, partially because it's the most straightforward, but also because that's where we have collections from for ASM. So I looked at various aspects of pottery in the Zuni area. So in about 1275 to 1350, in the Zuni area, you have two really common decorated pottery types. These are the most common decorated pottery types in the area. They are Heshatoothla polychrome, which is red slip on the inside, red slip on the outside. You have Quaquina polychrome, which is white slip on the inside, red slip on the outside. And they're mostly bowls. So other than having different interior bowl colors for the slip, I looked at other attributes to see what else might be different. And it turns out that everything is the same, except the slip color. So distribution, they are made at the same villages. They are moved between the same villages, and all areas of the Zuni area have both. So everything is the same in terms of distribution. Paint recipes and paint compositions, it's the same. They're using the same clays to make the pots. They're using the same recipes to make the glaze paints. Vessel sizes, both are large. And the assumption with the really large bowls is that they were being used in feast context. So ritual and ceremonial feasts. The exterior decoration are, and you can kind of see that here, the exterior decorations are the same. You've got a red slip, and then you've got thin white lines that band all the way around the vessel. So from a distance, you cannot tell these vessels apart. The interior decoration, the designs are mostly the same kinds of elements. You've got solids and opposing steps. You've got some parallel hatching. You can see that here. So the design, the painted designs are mostly the same, but the slip color is dramatically different. So everything is the same except the slip color. Why? Heshatoothla and Quaquina being used in feasts, I'm assuming at the same time that may or may not be true, but I think it's a conscious attempt by painters of these bowls to make them indistinguishable from one another at a distance. But even when there's food inside of them, they look different when you're close up to them. The food might cover up the design, but you're still going to be able to see the slip color. And I think what's happening is that folks are using color specifically to signal to the people who are using their bowls their unique history, their unique ancestry, the specific clans that they may be coming from. But on the outside of the bowls, they're saying, oh, we're all the same, we're all Zuni. But when you're using the bowl and you're looking at the bowl, but remember, you know, you're of a specific clan of Zuni. And part of that argument comes from Frank Cushing's argument and discussion about different colors, right? there's a whole bunch of different clans that move around and they come from different locations into Zuni, and that is part of their oral tradition, that's part of their history, that's part of their identity, right? Where they came from. And where they came from is from specific directions, and directions are specifically connected to specific colors. So I don't know if these colors can be put onto colors in the past. If they can, then a red interior would suggest that maybe there's a group coming from the south, and a white interior is saying that those are groups coming from the east. I'm not willing to go that far, but that's the kind of logic that I'm using, that these colors are a reminder to people using those vessels of where they came from. Even though we're all Zuni, we all have different origin stories. And so that's what I think is going on with those different colored interiors of pottery. But when I walk around so I'm very conscious of that now. And so when I walk around the vault, I see these kinds of vessels. And we call all of these vessels black on white. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if these were read as black on white by the people who used them. Right? These are all prior to the polychrome phenomena. But if this is a white exterior, then why are there white dots on the white exterior? And this is an unslipped white exterior that allows the brown paste to show through, the brown clay to show through. So although archaeologists call these black on white vessels, I don't know if ancestral Puebloans thought of them as black on white vessels, or if they may have thought of them as polychrome vessels, and that these kinds of things are what led to the eventual development of the polychrome slips that we see starting in the late 1200s. I don't know, but I think about it. Every time I see one of these, I think about it. And yeah, I don't have an answer, but it makes me wonder that what archaeologists call black on white may not have been black on white to the ancestral Puebloans who used them. Okay, example number 2, hatching. So in terms of reading something in the past differently than we view it now, or how ancient folks may have read pottery. And some of you may have heard this because I do talk about it whenever I go in the vault on tour. Stephen Plogg made what I consider an elegant argument in an American Antiquity article a few years ago about the idea of hatching on black and white pottery that has really never allowed me to look at hatching the same way again. So what I mean by hatching is these areas that are decorated with a bunch of parallel lines, as opposed to what this would be called as a solid. So this is an opposed solid hatching decoration, right? You've got solids, you've got hatched, you've got solid. So that's an opposed elements that are hatched and solid. Steve Plogg specifically focused on pottery from the Chaco time period and the Chaco region to talk about hatching. But hatching, or actually the opposed hatching with solids, is a design horizon that covers multiple types and multiple wearers from the Hopi region to the Rio Grande region through the 1100s and 1200s. So it's a fairly long time that we see hatching, I would say a little over 200 years. And it covers all of the Pueblo Southwest and the Mogollon area. So Steve Plogg argued that hatching never shows up on other mediums. So he looks at textiles, he looks at Kiva murals, he looks at rock art, he looks at baskets, and he says that you don't really have hatching. You have other opposed elements that are portrayed in various kinds of colors, but and often one of those elements is actually blue. So because of this, and that because from a distance, hatching actually looks kind of gray when opposed to the black, he argues that hatching is meant to be read as blue. You cannot create a blue color on pottery with most of the minerals that are available to Southwest potters. When you take turquoise and fire it, it turns black. When you take malachite, it turns black. And so it's very difficult to create a blue color. So his argument is that ancient Puebloans looked at hatching and they knew that that was supposed to read as blue. So to explore this really quickly this morning, I looked through some Kiva murals. These are some Kiva mural pictures that I could find that had gray or blue in them. This one, I think I actually cut off the bit of blue that was over here. My bad, although it does have a textile in it. But these grays and also maybe the lavenders are supposed to be blue. Not in any kind of opposing motif that would suggest that they're necessarily supposed to represent something similar on pottery. But I also looked at some pictures where we do have opposed motifs, right? So things that are opposed to one another. And in none of these cases are they hatched, but also in none of these cases are they blue. So I don't see hatching in Kiva mural images and in Kiva mural images of textiles specifically, but I also didn't, in this really brief look through, I didn't see any evidence that blue is used as part of that opposing motif kind of thing. That doesn't mean it's not true, and I still think Steve Plog's article is fantastic, but I wanted to give you guys sort of a sense of the kinds of data that he was looking at and the kinds of information that he's looking at. The other thing that he points out is that, and he's looking at a time period where really it is only black and white pottery, that a lot of the vessels that are hatched are meant to hold water. So this is a water jar with the very, or at least it's meant to hold liquids with the very narrow top. And then this is actually a canteen, which would be used to carry water. And there's these clear hatching motifs. And that is absolutely true, that in the time period he is looking at, a lot of the black and white pottery are these jars and these canteens that have hatching motifs on them. However, as you move through time into the 1200s and you start getting more polychrome and more red vessels, there is also hatching on bowls. I don't know if that means he's wrong. It could be that these bowls are being used for liquids as well. It could be that whether the bowl is being used for liquids or not, the motif of water is still really, really important. I don't know. But every time I see hatching when I go into the vault, I can't help but to think of Plog's argument, and I always think of it as the color blue, right? And I'll even stand off sometimes and kind of squint and say, oh, it is kind of a gray color, right? It definitely looks like a different color when it's opposed to the black. And so I love this argument. I love telling the story about this argument. I love the article. And I don't know how you prove it any better than he did. It's, you know, it's not something you can really do statistics on. I know that when you ask people at Zuni, they say, oh yeah, maybe. And an interesting story in that regard is we actually asked a Zuni artist once when we were out in the field, we excavated this pot that had hatching and it had this motif on it where it was solids and hatching that were opposed. And we wanted to put it on our field t-shirts. And so one of the Zuni students who was on the project said that he would design the shirt for us. And he actually designed the shirt so that this was, I think, pink, like a pinky purple. Like he didn't think of the hatching as part of the design. He actually created it so it was black and this other color. He didn't do it as hatching. And a part of me now, having read Steve's article, would love to go back and ask him, why did you do that? Because to us, clearly hatching is part of the design. It's part of how we describe it. And so, yeah, I've never heard a Zuni say, yes, it's definitely meant to be blue, but they don't seem to have a problem with the idea that, yeah, it could represent a different color and isn't meant to represent hatching. So then glaze paint. This is what I was originally going to talk about and pull out a whole bunch of different glaze vessels for you guys. So the use of glaze paint is a horizon that covers a wide area and lasts a long time. So all of these are different wares that have glaze types, and all of these wares have multiple different types. Rio Grande glazeware has 14 different types, depending on how you break down the types. Zuni has 3 different types. White Mountain Redware has a handful of different types. Acoma has 6 different types. So all of these have different types, and they're wares that continue through time technologically, but they're decorated differently. And so you get these different type names through time, and they last for almost 400 years. So this I consider a design horizon, right, is glaze paint. And just to remind everybody, a glaze paint is a special case of a mineral paint. And what makes it special is that it's actually vitrified. So it's fused to the surface of the pot. It is a glass. So to create a glass, you need 2 things. You need the right ingredients. So you have to have silica in there, and you have to have fluxes that can help bring down the temperature and melt the silica into glass. But you also need it to be really, really hot. So in other words, you can have the right ingredients, but the pot never gets hot enough. Or you could have the wrong ingredients, and no matter how hot the pot gets, it will never vitrify. It will never turn into a glass. And so glazes are a little bit different than some of the other paint types, because you really do need that combination of firing technology and the correct recipe. So I have looked at glaze paints a lot. This is the primary thing that I actually study, and really given some thought to why we start getting glaze paints. And I like this vessel a lot. Again, I've done a close-up of each of the glaze paints so that you can see in the right light that it's shiny and it's glassy. So this is an early glaze paint. Glaze started about 1275 in the Western Pueblo area. And one of the things that I've noticed about glaze paints is that really quickly they stop having hatching. And I have heard the argument that, oh, well, they didn't hatch them because it's hard to hatch with a glaze because it melts and it gets runny. Well, no, here's an early glaze with really beautiful hatching on it. These potters were exceedingly skilled. This idea that the potters don't know how to do things is honestly ridiculous. These are peoples who've been making pottery for a very long time. Yes, you can do fine line work with a glaze, and this is an example of that. But it does quickly fall out. And I think one of the reasons for that is because when you make a glaze, you need a flux. And the most common fluxes early on, so this vessel is made with copper flux, which serves to lower the melting temperature for silica. And the carbon minerals that are available to Pueblo people are mostly blues, right? So turquoises, malachites, and azurite. And so I suspect that there was an attempt to put blue paint on pottery, or it's possible that even earlier paints had pottery, but at some point it was the right combination of ingredients that got hot enough, that got hot enough that actually created a glaze paint. And so when you have that turquoise in there, that's a different way of also reading blue. And this is shiny, right? I'm pointing with my hand and you can't tell that. This is shiny. And galena, which becomes the most important mineral at some point, the most important flux in all of the glazes throughout the whole Pueblo world, galena is shiny. And that also, shiny minerals are also important to ancestral Pueblo people. Actually, the Acoma still have a word for shiny or sparkly paint. And whether or not that references back to glaze paint, we don't know, but just the importance of shiny, the importance of that as part of the cosmology. I don't want to call it like a separate color, but I have heard other archaeologists sort of refer to shiny as a property in and of itself that's important. And so you've got blue-green minerals and you've got shiny minerals that are going into these glaze paints that may represent the color blue. And so you don't need the hatching anymore because people see the glaze paint and they know to read that as the color blue. But I think even more importantly is that it like hatching, it might be meant to be blue-green, but more importantly, glazes look wet. So they're shiny, but they also look wet. They look like water. And so if the blue is meant to represent water, if you've got something that looks like water, that blue part just becomes sort of an added benefit, right? Here you have these paints that read as water. And over time, as they become runnier and runnier, they read even more like water. And these are the pictures. I couldn't show the vessels that are at ASM that have these streaks, these later vessels, because they are burial vessels. However, these I think are also wonderful examples of this streakiness and this runniness that happens with pottery. And there for a long time, I was taught actually in the 90s when I went to grad school, I was taught that this was a mistake, that potters had, quote, lost control of their glaze, or that the Spanish had come in and they just weren't able to get the access to the same kind of material to make their glaze paints. But archaeologists have done the chemistry. The ingredients and the paints are the same. It's the same recipes. They are intentionally, I think, making them more runny, and they're doing that to look more and more like water. And so when I see glaze paint now, I can't help but see that they look wet. And it may seem obvious to you as I say it that, well, yeah, of course they represent water. Look at them. But that is a fairly recent common idea that not most archaeologists share with me and a couple of my colleagues, that this is intentional. This is thought of as being a mistake still by many archaeologists. And I just don't think that's true. You don't make glaze paint for 300 years and then forget how to do it. So I think this is an intentional aesthetic. So my last example is the Ramos and Salado rules. And basically what these worry about is what colors are touching. So this is quick. There's not a lot to talk about with this, but this is an observation that Dave Phillips, who is the retired head curator at the Maxwell Museum, first made. And he asked me and other colleagues to start recording it on their pottery. Dave studies in the Costas Grandes region, and he initially observed that these two, quote, rules are present in pottery made there, and he wanted to see if these rules occur together in other places or if there's patterning in how these rules play out. And so what I mean is Salado rules, black never touches red. And I do know that there's a rule about this with snakes. I don't know what the rule is. It has nothing to do with this, but I know there's some rule about black and red in snakes. But so Salado rules are black never touches red. So if you look at these pictures, right, you've got the black color and you've got the red. And in all of these, they do not touch, right? So here you've got the white going right around the little black spots. And these are pots from various places. All of them are kind of within the same time frame here. And I think that he observes that this does sort of start in the 1200s and then continues on. So this is the Salado rule. And note there's a Costas Grandes type here that is part of that he initially observed this on. Then you have the Ramos rules, which is white. And by white, he means the lightest color. So here, the buff color, right? Here, this is technically what archaeologists would call a buff. But white never touches red. Now this one's kind of sloppy, so you've got a little bit of touching here, but that seems to be more an issue of the paint job and not specifically the color. Oh, I'm sorry. Salado rules occur in Western Pueblo area. We do not see this in the Rio Grande. This rule I never see on pottery that I study in the Rio Bajo or in the central Rio Grande area. They just don't. You don't see this. This rule you see all the time in the Rio Grande. And although this is a Howie-Ku polychrome from the Zuni area, it is a glaze and it follows the same kind of design aesthetic and design rules as the Rio Grande. We didn't have a good example that wasn't a burial pot. This one is from an earlier time period. So does that fit into part of what Dave is thinking about? We don't know, but we report this information to him. And then this is again another pot from the Casas Grandes area. So you can see that it's different than the pot I showed you earlier. So we seem to have patterning, right? You get both rules playing out in the Casas Grandes area. You get this rule playing out in the Eastern Pueblo area and in part in the Zuni area. And you get this rule playing out in the Western Pueblo and the Mogollon area. And so there does seem to be patterning. And I do think that that's interesting. And I do think that it's interesting that there may be some Hohokam pottery and Chinteras types that follow these rules as well. I don't know what it means. Dave doesn't actually know what it means either. He doesn't know if it's cosmological. He doesn't know if it's identity, but he does think it's really interesting that it's consistent and that does seem to be patterning that plays out in different ways in different regions. And when I see a vessel that has 3 colors on the same surface, I always kind of check which colors touch each other. And I think about it and I can walk you to different pots in the vault that follow these 2 different rules. And so what it means, I don't know. This is Dave's research project, but there are bigger patterns, and hopefully he'll be publishing on this fairly soon because I think he's been collecting these data now for a number of years. And the other thing about our vault is every so often I get one of these, and I can walk you to these too. So if you've got these Ramos rules and these Salado rules, what's going on with this one, right? This is a Salado polychrome. And every so often in the vault, and I'm sure in other vaults and other museums, there are things that break the rules that Dave has identified. So does it mean anything? How do we interpret that? How is Dave dealing with those? And he right now is like, oh, he thinks it's a mistake, right? And either it's a mistake by someone who hasn't internalized the rules like a child, or maybe it's somebody who's trying to copy pottery, but they don't, quote, understand the rules. But it could also be a rebellion, right? And this is the way I tend to think about pottery, right? This could be someone who's like, yeah, I'm not buying into your rules. And for whatever reason, they are specifically scoffing at the rules. It's also possible that there were no rules and Dave is just imagining things, even though he seems to have patterning that may be meaningful. But again, I don't know. This is just something when I walk into the vault, this is another one of these horizons that I pay attention to and I think about when I'm thinking about all of the things that go through my head when I deal with pots. And so this is why I can spend hours in the vault and I can talk about pottery for hours, is because there's lots of little things like this that I don't talk about out loud, but go through my head. So any questions about that one?
Let's see. So Katie is asking, could there possibly be technological reasons for the color patterning?
Possibly. I don't think there's been so one, this cross cuts various technologies in terms of the different kinds of pottery that's being made and the different kinds of materials. And so like if you look at this one, I think it's pretty clear, right? Like the Howie-Ku is a glaze paint. This is Hohokam pottery, which is a very different kind of clays and paints that are being used. And then this is from the Casas Grandes area. And so I don't think there would be a technological reason. I haven't thought that through completely, but it just seems like there's so much diversity in the different kinds of materials and technology that it seems like it should be something more than that, but I don't know.